Welcome, dear dreamer, to Sleepy Quest, your quiet refuge for magical bedtime stories. Tonight, let go of your day, breathe deeply, and sink into the soft hush of candlelight and ancient pages. If you find comfort in our stories, we invite you to like, subscribe, and return each evening for new tales spun in calm and wonder. Now, tuck in, get cozy, and let the magic begin. There is a table in the far back corner of the Hogwarts library that students rarely choose. Not because it is drafty or dim, nor because the chair legs creak too much when moved. No, this table is avoided for a reason, both simpler and stranger. It feels watched, not unkindly, but attentively, as though the table itself remembers who sat there last and is waiting, patiently, quietly, for them to return. It rests beneath a high-arched window where soft light from the setting sun filters through in golden beams, spilling over the dusty spines of old books. Ivy curls lazily outside the glass, brushing against the panes with each evening breeze, and shadows fall gently across the carved wood of the table, dancing like faint ghosts of old readers lost in thought. Most students hurry past it, choosing instead the busier tables under enchanted lanterns or near the flickering fireplace. But if you ever found yourself wandering the library just before supper, when the lamps are half lit and the whispers grow slower, you might feel it, a tug, a hush, like someone once said something important at that table, and the air is still holding its breath. Long ago it was favoured by a Ravenclaw girl named Mirelle Thorne. She came often, not always for assignments or revision, but simply to sit. She would spread out parchment and nibble a bit of cinnamon tea biscuit while leafing through obscure spellbooks or forgotten herbals no one else touched. Mirelle liked silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that hums, like the hush between raindrops or the pause before a candle flickers. She had a way of noticing things others missed. She would sometimes look up from her book and smile softly at a floating speck of dust, as if it had whispered a joke just for her. Her fingers traced the runes in the margins like they were old friends. And always, tucked between the pages of whichever book she was reading, was her bookmark, a long, elegant strip of green velvet, tipped with a tiny feather and a charm shaped like a moon. The other students called her odd, but not unkindly. Mirelle didn't mind. She had the library, and the library had her. One autumn, during her 5th year, Mirelle stopped coming. No one said why. The professors were quiet about it, and though some rumours floated, a transfer, a sick relative, an accident in the North Tower, nothing was certain. What was certain, though, was that she had left something behind. It was the librarian who found it, Madame Everwick, a woman as old as some of the books and twice as stern. She had been shelving a stack of alchemy volumes when she noticed it. Mirelle's bookmark, still tucked between the pages of The Language of Trees, a guide to arboreal enchantments. The book sat open, as if still expecting her return, the charm resting against the parchment with quiet weight. Madame Everwick, curious but unsurprised, closed the book, pressed the bookmark gently back inside, and returned it to the shelf behind the quietest table near the window. And that's when the waiting began. Days passed, then weeks. Seasons slipped by like the flutter of turned pages. The table remained untouched. Books shifted around it. Lamps were replaced, shelves dusted, but that corner of the library stayed still, preserved somehow in the silence of a memory. A few curious students did try to sit there. They would lower their bags cautiously, glance at the old books nearby, and begin to write or read. But soon, always soon, they would shift uncomfortably in their chair, glance over their shoulder, and leave before finishing. One student, a second-year Hufflepuff, said it felt like someone was politely waiting for me to move. Even Madame Everwick, with all her calm, admitted that the air near that table felt different. She dusted it weekly, sometimes humming absent-mindedly as she did, though she was not the sort to hum, and each time she would glance at the high window, the beams of sun, the way the ivy moved like fingers brushing glass, and then, without fail, she would look to the bookshelf just behind the chair. Because the language of trees still sat there, untouched, unopened, and quietly pulsing with some soft charm that no one had cast and no one dared disturb. Some say they've seen the bookmark shimmer when no one is near. Others claim that the moon-shaped charm hums ever so faintly when the wind rattles the windows, but all agree on this: the table remembers, and someone, is still waiting. Years passed, new students came, old ones left, professors retired, and still the table remained, untouched, unchanged, a silent promise in a room full of whispering books. Then one dusky afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the library windows and the lamps flickered in the softened light, a girl named Elira wandered in. She was small, quiet, and new, not particularly fond of crowds, and far more at ease with her nose in a book than in conversation. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just walking slowly between shelves, letting her fingertips glide across the bindings like feeling for a heartbeat. And then she saw it. The table. It wasn't the light that drew her, though the sunset through the window was soft and golden. Nor was it the chair, or the way the ivy brushed the pane. It was something else. Something like an invitation, like a breath held gently. She sat down. At first, nothing happened. She took out a slim journal, a quill, and a piece of sugared lemon biscuit from her pocket. She nibbled. She wrote. She leaned back and listened to the sound of pages turning from faraway corners of the library, and then, as though the room itself were exhaling, a soft sigh rose from the shelf behind her. Elira turned. There, where the spine of the language of trees rested, she saw a glimmer. Green velvet, feather, moon. The book had nudged itself slightly outward, just enough to be noticed. Curious, she stood, reached, and pulled it free. The bookmark fell into her hand, warm, surprisingly, as if it had just been used. The charm shimmered faintly, casting a crescent shadow across her palm. She opened the book. Inside, in the margin of the first page, written in careful, looping script, was a single sentence. If you're reading this, please read slowly. I waited so long to be heard. The ink was sepia-toned, as though it had been steeped in tea. Its curves and curls were delicate, purposeful. The handwriting of someone who wrote for beauty, not speed. Elira ran her thumb gently beneath the line, careful not to smudge. The page felt thick beneath her fingers, the way old parchment often does, and smelled faintly of pressed leaves and dust. She sat back down, the book open before her now, and read. If you're reading this, please read slowly. I waited so long to be heard. It was signed with a single initial. Monsieur Elira's brow furrowed. She turned the next page, and the next. Each one contained tiny notes along the margins, not summaries or study scrawls, but musings. Whispers, really, little thoughts captured and left like petals between the lines. Do trees remember where they were planted? This spell feels like a lullaby. Try the elms by the east wall. Their leaves hum when it rains. It was unlike anything Elira had ever seen. There was magic in these notes. Not the kind you learn in charms or transfiguration, but a quieter kind, a listening kind. Someone had written into this book not just to record, but to leave behind pieces of themselves, to keep something alive in ink and paper. She turned the final page. At the bottom, written almost too faint to see, was a line that read, "If you find my bookmark, leave it where it waits." I think it remembers me. Elira closed the book softly and looked at the bookmark in her hand. The green velvet had frayed slightly along one edge. The feather, dark grey with a silvery sheen, trembled in the faintest breeze from the nearby window, and the charm, the tiny silver moon, glowed ever so gently, even without light to catch it. She felt as if the table had exhaled again, a soft settling, like someone had just walked through a dream and found rest at last. Later that evening, after dinner, and before curfew, Elira returned to the library. She walked through the lantern-lit corridors in slippered steps, her wand tucked in her sleeve, just in case Filch's ghost cat decided to stir. But the halls were quiet. The portraits along the walls were either dozing or too polite to ask where she was going. Inside the library only one lamp remained lit, the one by the high window, where the ivy touched the glass and the dust seemed to sparkle in its golden beam. Elira approached the bookshelf slowly. She slid the language of trees back into place. Then, with the care of someone laying down a memory, she placed the bookmark atop the book's spine. It shimmered once, like breath on glass, and stilled. From that night forward, Elira returned often. She never took the bookmark, but she always greeted it. Sometimes she would leave notes of her own in the margins of books nearby, not many, and never in ink, only in pencil that could be brushed away. Little things, observations, dreams, questions not meant to be answered. Today the wind smelled like rosemary. I wonder if books ever fall asleep. The page turned itself just once, when I blinked. Other students began to whisper about the girl who sat at the window table, about how the feathered charm sometimes spun without touch, about how the light there was always just a little warmer than anywhere else. Madame Everwick noticed too. She said nothing, of course, but once, as she passed Elira's table on a quiet afternoon, she paused, adjusted the lamp, and muttered under her breath, "Welcome back." The table had changed, not physically. Its shape and scratches and sun-worn edges were the same, but the feeling had softened. Where once it held a silence that felt like holding its breath, it now sighed gently, like a place that had been remembered. And sometimes, in that space between lamplight and sleep, Elira would catch the faintest trace of cinnamon in the air. No one else ever noticed it, but to her it was as familiar as a worn page or a whisper in the margins. One winter evening, snow falling soft beyond the high window, Elira returned to find a slip of parchment tucked beneath her usual chair. It wasn't there before, of that she was sure, and it wasn't the sort of thing Madame Everwick would leave lying about. It was folded once, with no name, no mark. She opened it. Inside, written in the same looping sepia script, were just 3 words. "Thank you, reader." The parchment dissolved in her hands like the edge of a dream. There was no sound, no sparkle, no puff of smoke, only warmth, the sense of being seen and smiled at from somewhere old and kind and far away. Elira sat down, her fingers resting lightly on the tabletop, and closed her eyes. It was the first time the library had ever felt like it belonged to her. From then on, the story of the bookmark changed. No longer was it just the tale of the girl who never returned. It became something more, the story of those who listen, those who pause, those who read not only with eyes, but with heart. Because some pages don't turn until someone is ready to hear them. And some memories wait, patiently, faithfully, for the right reader to come along and remember them into being. Before the bookmark, before the hush in the margins, there was simply Mirelle Thorne, a quiet fifth-year Ravenclaw with a taste for obscure spellcraft, old ink, and cinnamon-steeped tea. Most who passed her in the corridors of Hogwarts would remember only the scent, warm and spicy, like autumn leaves curling in firelight, and the way her robes always carried it as she brushed quietly past. She didn't raise her hand often in class, though she always had the answers. Her wand work was graceful, not showy, and her parchment never bore corrections. Only small sketches in the corners, leaves, phases of the moon, the profile of a crow. Professors appreciated her attentiveness. Peers appreciated her distance. She was not unfriendly, just distant, like someone who was always partly elsewhere, listening to something just beyond the veil of the moment. A hush in the wind, a shadow behind a curtain, a bookmark, gently pulsing. What most didn't know was that Mirelle had been coming to the library since her very first week at school, long before she understood the maze of staircases or the strange moods of her house ghost. She had found the back corner table one evening when she was lost, chasing a parchment that had been tugged from her hand by a mischievous draught. She followed it through whispering shelves, down an aisle of atlases that smelled of old ink and tobacco, and past a cabinet of odd clocks that ticked in no discernible rhythm. When she caught it, finally, it was fluttering beneath the arched window where the ivy touched glass, like fingers pressing softly to be let in. She sat down without meaning to. Perhaps she was tired, perhaps something called her. And once she was there, the library shifted just slightly, like a house taking a deep breath. The table creaked, the lamp flickered, and somewhere far behind her, a page turned on its own. Mirelle never left that table. Not really. Even after curfew, even when the tower lights dimmed and the house elves came to stoke the fires, some part of her stayed behind, watching the sun filter in, letting the shadows stretch long and familiar across the wood grain, listening to the echoes held in spines and stitched bindings. She made it a habit, a pot of cinnamon tea brewed in her dormitory, a biscuit wrapped in cloth, and a new book each night from the shelves behind her chair. She read slowly, as if each line was a spell to be unwound like thread. She read about wind-charmed stones and the alchemy of winter and creatures that only existed in forgotten languages. Each reading, she left a note, a question, a wondering, and every book she touched, she marked with her velvet bookmark. The moon charm on its end wasn't bought or gifted. She'd made it herself in a little side class on enchanted trinket smithing, though few remembered that class existed. The velvet had come from an old cloak, the feather from a crow that had landed on the windowsill one morning and watched her until she took its offering from between the panes. She had whispered something to the feather before binding it, a small, soft enchantment that wasn't quite a spell. It didn't glow, didn't hum, didn't sparkle, but it stayed warm, always warm, the charm, the feather, the thread. They remembered her. That was the kind of magic she believed in. Mirelle never talked about why she read in the way she did, why she never took books to the dormitory, why she always returned them to the shelf in the same place, same angle, same hush. But one evening, when another Ravenclaw, boy named Terrin, approached her with a question about runes, she smiled gently and said, "Books breathe when no one's watching. You just have to sit still long enough to hear it." Terrin didn't understand, but he remembered the sentence for the rest of his life. And then, quite suddenly, Mirelle was gone. No one announced it. No note was found, no spell miscast, no curse broken. Her bed was made, her trunk untouched. Her owl, perched still in the tower, hooted once and then flew into the clouds. Some said she had been chosen for a secret apprenticeship, that her notes had caught the eye of a retired librarian from Ilvermorny. Others claimed she had found a hidden book that opened to another world, and she had simply followed it. But the most whispered tale, the one passed quietly by parchment in study halls and beneath blankets by wandlight, was this: that Morel Thorne had not left at all, that she had become part of the library, her voice etched into margins, her breath bound into bookmarks, her thoughts lingering in the spaces between. Some say that if you steep cinnamon tea in the library just before dusk, her scent will appear. That if you trace a book's spine and whisper "thank you" before reading, the page will fall open to exactly what you need. Elira didn't know all of this when she sat at the table. She didn't know Morel's name, only that the bookmark was warm, and the words in the margins sounded like someone exhaling a long-held truth. But in the weeks that followed, as she returned to that table again and again, she began to notice things. A word in a textbook that wasn't there before, a drawing of a leaf that matched the one outside the window, though it hadn't fallen yet, a note in the back of a herbology guide that read, "Cinnamon warms even through grief, let the cup be full." Elira began to bring her own tea. Not cinnamon at first, she preferred chamomile. But one night something tugged at her memory, and she brewed a cup of cinnamon just to see. The room smelled of home. The lamp above the table flickered, then stilled. The ivy brushed the window pane with greater insistence, and a slip of parchment fluttered down from the shelf above. Elira caught it. It read simply, "The girl with the cinnamon tea is never forgotten." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. That night, Elira left her own note on a folded corner of a book about enchanted birds. "Thank you, Morel. I'll remember you too." Then she pressed the bookmark into the pages of The Language of Trees, nestled it against the moonlit charm, and left the library with candlelight in her hair and the hush of remembered magic at her back. The table watched her go, not with sadness, but with warmth, with memory. It had been waiting a long time, but someone had listened. Madame Everwick was the kind of librarian Hogwarts needed, not necessarily the kind it deserved. She had been there longer than many of the portraits, a quiet figure wrapped in deep grey shawls, her hair pinned into a practical bun, spectacles balanced on the very tip of her nose. She was precise, unsentimental, and had a gaze that could silence a room with the flick of an eyebrow. Students feared crossing her, not because she was cruel, but because her disappointment lingered like dust on forbidden books. But what most never noticed was that Madame Everwick listened deeply, not in the way that hears noise or complaint, but in the way old buildings do, the way stone seems to hold memory, the way wood groans at just the right moment to respond to a whisper. She walked the library's labyrinthine corridors not with impatience, but reverence. Each shelf she dusted, each book she reshelved, each desk she polished. All were acts of gentle stewardship. She didn't just care for the books, she knew them. She knew which ones grumbled when unopened too long, which ones refused to reveal their secrets unless read aloud, and which ones liked being placed beside certain neighbours. She knew that a history of the Goblin rebellions, uncensored, tended to burst into flame if stored beside soothing incantations for restless spirits, and that the enchanted atlas of the Scottish Highlands once updated itself only when placed in moonlight. So when Morel Thorne stopped coming, Madame Everwick noticed. It wasn't immediate. Students came and went. Study patterns shifted with seasons, with exams. But after a fortnight, When the back corner table remained empty each evening, and the language of trees had not been checked out or touched, Everwick felt it, like a missing word on the tip of her tongue. One late afternoon, as the last light slanted through the high windows, she went to the table herself, not to sit. She never sat at student desks, but to stand quietly beside it, to listen. The lamp above flickered as if sensing her presence. Dust motes danced lazily in the golden glow. The ivy tapped the glass once, and then, faintly, something like a sigh. She moved to the shelf behind the chair, fingers brushing along the row of volumes that hadn't been touched in weeks. And there it was, the language of trees, pushed ever so slightly forward as if leaning. She pulled it gently from the shelf, cradled it in both hands and opened it. The bookmark slipped free. At first, it was just velvet and feather. Then the moon charm caught the light, and Everwick's expression changed. Not visibly, not fully, but her shoulders shifted slightly and her breath paused just long enough to be noticed. She flipped through the pages. Read the notes. Her lips did not smile, but the corners softened. She traced a line that read, "Some leaves only fall when no one is looking." Then she turned to the first page and read Morell's quiet message to the reader. Everwick did not speak. She closed the book, replaced the bookmark carefully, and shelved it in the exact same spot. But from that evening onward, something subtle shifted. She began lighting that corner lamp earlier in the day. She had the table polished every Sunday. And once, on a Tuesday evening when the corridors were slick with storm rain, she placed a small cinnamon sachet beneath the lamp, tucked into the drawer where most students never looked. She didn't tell anyone. But the library remembered. More than once, she found the bookmark moved, always just slightly, always back into the book. By morning, she never questioned who had touched it. She didn't need to. When Elira began visiting, Everwick watched without intruding. She noted how the girl read slowly, with the same kind of stillness Morell once had. How she brought her own tea, sat for long stretches without turning a page, and sometimes whispered questions to the books themselves. She never interrupted. But one day, in the drawer beneath the table, she left a small quill with a fine silver tip. No note, no explanation. The next morning, the quill was gone, and in its place, a folded parchment with a message scrawled in delicate pencil. She speaks in the quiet. I'm learning to listen. From that day, the two of them, Elira and Madame Everwick, shared something unspoken. When Elira forgot a book on the table, Everwick returned it not to the general shelves, but to that same corner space. When she saw Elira humming softly while reading, she hummed the same tune under her breath while shelving new scrolls. And once, during an especially cold evening in February, when the windows rattled and the fire in the hearth wouldn't catch, Elira came into the library to find a steaming mug of cinnamon tea waiting beside her lamp. No note, no cup holder, just steam rising in slow spirals, like a welcome. That evening, Elira left a note in the language of trees that read, I think she still walks the shelves, doesn't she? I felt her near the hourglasses today. Madame Everwick found it the next morning. She did not smile, not quite. But she placed the book back with reverence, and for the first time in a long while, she whispered aloud, Of course she does. Because librarians, more than most, understand that stories never truly leave ye, they linger. In ink, in breath, in the soft hush of turning pages, and sometimes, if you're still enough, you can feel when someone is reading over your shoulder long after they've gone. That day, the library smelled of cinnamon, ink, and the faintest warmth of someone remembered. No one at Hogwarts could say for certain when the bookmark became enchanted. It bore no official charm from the charms corridor, no registered enchantment from the Ministry's Bureau of Magical Artifacts, and no glowing sigils drawn in wand light. It had simply become. Like the way ivy knows how to climb or how a melody hums itself back into memory, the bookmark held magic that had grown slowly, gently, with time and care and silence. But those who touched it, those who truly noticed, felt something. Elira had felt it first as warmth, not heat, but a quiet kind of comfort, like a scarf left by someone who loved you on a chair you hadn't sat in for years. Later, it had become a tug, a sense that something inside the pages of the language of trees waited not to be read, but heard, as if the book itself wanted to be understood by someone who would listen without rushing. Then with time, the magic began to echo outward, not loudly, not suddenly. The bookmark was far too polite for that. But it began to touch things, gently, thoughtfully, the way Mirelle had once touched spines and corners and the edges of folded paper. One evening, as Elira sat writing beneath the library's flickering lamp, her quill paused of its own accord. She blinked, looked down. The tip had stopped just above the word whisper, refusing to land. A faint hum buzzed at the edge of her ears, not a sound exactly, but a stillness. And when she looked again, her parchment now held an extra line beneath her own writing. Some words are best left spoken only by silence. It hadn't been her quill. She looked around. No one was nearby. No movement stirred in the corners. Only the soft shifting of books, the occasional sigh of parchment settling, and the eternal brush of ivy against the window pane. The next night, it happened again. This time, a book she had not chosen, The Minor Runes of Memory, slipped slightly forward on the shelf as she passed. Curious, she opened it. Inside, folded neatly beneath the title page, was a slip of velvet ribbon. Not Mirelle's bookmark, this one was blue, edged with gold thread, but clearly touched by the same kind of spell. There was no charm, no feather, no moon. But when she laid it across her wrist, the scent of cinnamon filled the air. The ribbon dissolved moments later, vanishing like mist. Elira didn't ask questions. She simply sat, wrote, and left another note in the margin of the language of trees. She's teaching the books now, isn't she? Over the following days, small changes began to appear throughout the library. Nothing anyone could prove. But readers began to find the books they needed without searching. A third-year boy who had been fretting over a transfiguration essay stumbled upon an old essay tucked inside the cover of Transmuting Through Time, annotated in what looked like his own handwriting, except he had never written it. A first-year girl, crying quietly in a corner, found a handkerchief folded into the binding of her potions textbook, with the faintest trace of lavender sewn into the corner. A sleepy student who had dozed off among herbology tomes awoke to find his dreams had been written softly on his parchment, not word for word, but the feeling of them, drawn like fog. These weren't miracles, they weren't even truly spells. They were remembrances, whispers, soft traces of presence, the kind of magic that lives not in wands or wizards, but in care. Madame Everwick noticed it all. She watched the books shift. She watched the students move more quietly. She watched how the light over the back corner table always seemed warmer, even on grey days. But most of all, she watched Elira, the way she sat still, listened, paused, before turning a page. She never interfered. But one snowy afternoon, as she dusted the hourglass shelf, she discovered something strange. A letter addressed to no one, folded inside a copy of the Listening Wand. It was short, written in soft graphite, and read, "To the librarian who listens. Thank you for not speaking when silence is sacred. You keep the breath between the pages alive." Everwick stood still for a long time, the duster resting in her palm, the snow tapping faintly at the windows. Then, without a word, she tucked the note into her pocket and continued dusting. A little slower, a little softer. Elsewhere in the library, another bookmark appeared. This one shaped like a curling leaf, pressed from silver, glinting faintly in the spines of a book no one had read in decades. Its presence felt familiar, not as a copy, but a cousin, a companion to the original moon-charmed feather of Mirel's creation. It stayed only a few hours. Then, like a dream or a thought half-remembered, it was gone again. But those few hours were enough. A boy who found it returned the next day with an offering, a slip of music written in his own hand, folded into a book on magical harmonics. "It just came to me," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Bit by bit, the bookmark's gentle spell began to grow, not into power or fame, but into presence, into a quiet, humming sense that the library was no longer simply full of books, but full of noticing. And Mirel, wherever she had gone, seemed to be reading through the eyes of others, of Elira, of the boy with the music, of Madame Everwick dusting between the bindings, of the first-year girl who now brought a second handkerchief wherever she studied, just in case. Because a bookmark, after all, is a promise, a pause, a breath held so that the story might return. And when it holds the memory of someone who read with such care, with such soft longing, it becomes more than thread and charm. It becomes a spell, and the spell was still unfolding. Elira returned to the library that evening with a blanket tucked under her arm, and a soft, pear-coloured candle in her hand. It was nearly closing time, but Madame Everwick gave her a gentle nod from the front desk, eyes half closed behind her spectacles. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Elira made her way to the back corner, Mirel's corner, as she had come to call it in her thoughts, and settled into the chair beside the fireplace. The warmth was modest, the kind that crackled just enough to remind you it was real. She lit her candle and placed it on the armrest, watching the flame catch with a slow, elegant curl. In her satchel rested the language of trees, the worn old book that had first called her. She opened it gently, letting its familiar scent rise up. A mix of parchment, ink, and something that reminded her faintly of pine. The bookmark was still there, and it glowed just a little, just enough to let her know it had not forgotten her. She touched it softly, feather to fingertip. The tiny moon still shimmered faintly as if caught in a memory of night. And for the first time since she had discovered it, Elira closed her eyes while touching the charm and let herself simply listen. The silence was not empty. It never had been. It was filled with footsteps that had once walked these aisles, with sighs of readers lost in love stories, with the tick of parchment under fingers, longing for answers. It was the sound of lives not quite gone, but sleeping, tucked between pages, wrapped in ink, breathed into every line. And then, not a voice, not quite, but a presence. It shimmered faintly in her thoughts, like the way light dances behind closed eyelids when someone nearby strikes a match. There was no face, no word, only a sense of waiting, of gratitude. Elira opened her eyes, but she wasn't startled. She didn't feel frightened, only a warm ache, like missing someone she'd never truly met. She took her quill and parchment and began to write. Not with effort, but with release. as though her hand already knew the letters and had simply been waiting for her to allow them through. The words came gently. To the one who left this bookmark behind, I hear you, I see you, and I will keep the story safe. She folded the note, slipped it between the final pages, and kissed the moon charm gently with her breath. The glow dimmed, not vanished, only resting. As she sat back, the candle flickered slightly. She looked around. For a brief, tender moment, the shadows along the far wall shaped themselves into the outline of a girl, or a memory of a girl, sitting cross-legged, reading a book with a feather tucked behind one ear. Mirelle? Perhaps just a dream. The figure vanished before she could decide, fading back into warm darkness. But the feeling lingered, that something had settled, that something had come home. When Elira left the library that night, the candle had burned low. She didn't take the book with her. She left it tucked gently beneath the chair cushion, the bookmark still inside. Not hidden. Waiting. The next morning, the library felt brighter. No one mentioned it. No one noticed anything out of place. But the light from the high windows scattered more gently across the shelves, and the dust motes danced like they remembered music. Students moved with quieter feet, as if they too sensed that something sacred had been stitched into the air. And the books, they shimmered, not visibly, not with spellwork, but in presence, as if they were watching, breathing, listening. Weeks passed. Elira came often, always to the same corner. She didn't speak to the books, she simply read, wrote, and occasionally left small things tucked inside, pressed leaves, short poems, quiet dreams she had half forgotten until they returned in her sleep. One evening she found something waiting in return, a folded page with delicate writing in lilac ink. Magic is not only in the wand, but in the pause between turning pages. Thank you for listening. No name. But the ink smelled faintly of moonflower and mint. Madame Everwick, too, began to leave space. A cushion fluffed here, a lamp angled just so, a small tray of warm tea placed quietly beside Elira's chair, without fanfare. She never asked questions, but one evening she stopped beside the girl and whispered, "It's nice, isn't it? When a book decides to remember you back." Then she walked away, leaving Elira with a heart full of something soft and eternal. As spring crept into the windows and the ivy began to bud once more, the bookmark began to fade, not vanish, not ever, but dim softly into rest. Its moon stopped glowing. The feather stilled. Its work perhaps was done. But the spell that had grown from Mirelle's touch to Elira's hands, to the many hearts who wandered the shelves, that spell remained. You could see it, if you knew where to look. In the way students paused before returning a book, brushing its cover first with reverence. In the way lonely ones found comfort in the quiet corners, always just warm enough to welcome sleep. In the way the old grandfather clock near the restricted section ticked with a faint rhythm like a heartbeat, slow, patient, dreaming. And somewhere deep between the pages of 100 books, a feather slept beside a moon that no longer needed to glow in order to be known. The whisper had become a presence, and the presence had become a promise. That in this library, in these shelves and shadows and stories, nothing was ever truly lost, just waiting. And still glowing, it began with silence, not the kind that weighs heavily in classrooms when exams are passed out, nor the expectant hush before a teacher enters the room. This was a different kind of silence, soft, old, and humming faintly with knowing. The kind that lives inside ink bottles left uncorked too long, or parchment rolled so many times it forgets what it once held. In the northwest tower of the library, where the ceiling sloped steeply and owls sometimes nested in the eaves, sat a peculiar little alcove known only to the few who dared study long after curfew. There were no signs, no markers, no special enchantments to draw attention to it. Just a crooked arch, a squat table, and a tall window with a diamond-shaped crack that let in moonlight like a slice of silver glass. And there, every Wednesday at twilight, came Bastien Wren. He was not a loud boy nor particularly gifted in wand work. He didn't win duels or find himself caught in pranks or have a name that stirred much recognition beyond the roll call. But Bastien had something few others noticed and even fewer valued. He listened. He listened to walls, to wind, to words not spoken aloud, and most importantly, he listened to ink. It had started in his second year, quite by accident. He had spilled a vial of ink, rich midnight blue, across his parchment in frustration during a long study session on arithmetic theory. Muttering, he had gone to clean it, only to find the ink shifting, faintly pulsing, forming symbols he did not write. Words, his words, thoughts he hadn't said aloud, feelings he'd tried not to acknowledge, things he had buried under schoolwork, under silence. "I don't understand any of this," the ink had written in soft, curling letters. "And I don't know how to ask for help." He had stared at it for minutes, long, aching minutes. And then he whispered, "But someone's listening." From that day forward, he returned every week with the same inkwell, the one he'd used that night. He never told anyone what it could do. Not even his best friend, Mira, who often studied nearby, nor the kindly librarian who brought him tea when the evenings stretched long. He simply wrote. And the ink answered. At first, it responded with thoughts he hadn't voiced, then questions he was too shy to ask. Then gently it began offering him things, not spells or charms, but reflections. Why do you believe you must know everything alone? What if not understanding is the beginning, not the end? Would you speak to yourself the way you imagine others speak of you? The ink was never harsh. It never told him what to do. It only listened, and then offered soft, shimmering suggestions like ripples across a calm pond. Over time, Bastien began to change. Not in loud, dramatic ways. He still fumbled in one technique. Still got nervous during oral exams, still preferred shadows to spotlights. But his presence deepened. He became the kind of person people gravitated toward when they didn't know they needed comfort. Someone whose silence didn't feel empty, but inviting. He noticed things. When someone's robe sleeve was frayed, when a classmate sat farther from others than usual, when a sigh was just a little too long, and slowly others began to come to him. "Bastien," Mira whispered one day, "do you ever just feel like your head's too full and no one would understand even if you tried?" He didn't answer with advice. He handed her a small piece of parchment and a fresh quill. Then he nodded to the cracked window and left her alone in the alcove for a while. When she returned the next morning, eyes red but soft, she hugged him tightly. "You're the only one who doesn't try to fix me," she murmured. He didn't reply, but that night, when he returned to the alcove, he found his inkwell slightly warm to the touch, though the library was cold. The ink shimmered faintly in the bottle, as if it had heard too. And maybe it had. One evening, Bastien asked, not aloud but in writing, where the ink had come from, why it listened. The answer unfolded in slow, graceful curls. We are memory. We are thought given rest. We are what remains when too many voices have nowhere left to speak. And then, you are not the first. He blinked, heart slowing. His quill trembled in his hand. "Not the first?" he wrote. The answer was longer this time. It took form gently, in strokes that shimmered like candlelight on wet stone. "There was once a professor of listening charms long before your time. She believed some emotions were too fragile for voice, so she taught her students to write with enchanted ink that listened more than it answered. Their feelings were poured into bottles like stars into jars. The practice faded, but a few wells of such ink remained. Bastian read it again, then again. He closed his eyes and imagined the others. Quiet souls, long ago, leaning over parchment in moonlit rooms, whispering their feelings through quill and bottle. He imagined the softness of those moments, the courage it took to share something never meant for noise. He opened his eyes and dipped his quill once more. "Thank you," he wrote, "not just for answering, for staying." The ink shimmered. Always. Outside the window, the wind curled around the tower like a sleeping cat. Inside, the candle flickered low, casting long shadows across the old oak table. The library was silent, but the silence was not empty. And as Bastian Wren closed his notebook, he realized he was not alone. Not now, not ever again. Because someone or something had taught him that the truest magic wasn't in spells cast or charms spoken. It was in being heard and in hearing back. There were stories in the Hogwarts library, not just within the books, but between them. Some whispered that the stacks themselves shifted slightly at night, curling inward as if to share secrets with each other. Others believed that certain tomes moved of their own accord, not by charm or mischief, but by longing, a desire to be found perhaps by the right reader. And in the quietest wing, nestled just beyond the corridor of enchanted herbals and beside the ladder to the diviner's loft, there lived an inkless quill. At first glance it was nothing special, a plain feather grey as storm, clouds and stiff with age. It rested in a glass case behind the restricted aisle, not locked merely, undisturbed. But to those who walked softly, who lingered, who asked questions no one else thought to ask, it revealed something more. It was Martha Lewin, a quiet fifth year with a soft spot for ancient runes and peppermint tea, who first noticed the quill was never quite in the same position 2 days in a row. She had been spending her evenings tucked in a high-backed armchair near the case, translating old spell scrolls that smelled of lavender and dust. She liked the silence there. It was thoughtful, clean, not lonely, just focused. And every time she returned, the quill had shifted. Once tilted slightly forward, once turned completely around, once pressed flat, as if laid down by a hand that never left fingerprints. One evening, long after dinner, and well past the hour when most lanterns dimmed, she leaned forward and whispered, "Are you awake?" The glass fogged faintly where her breath touched it. Then, something impossible, a sound, light, dry, papery, like parchment being ruffled by a sigh. And the quill, without wind or hand, gave the tiniest twitch. Martha stared. It didn't move again, but the silence around her thickened, softened, almost expectant. She waited, and then, slowly, carefully, she opened her bag, withdrew a scrap of clean parchment, and pressed it gently to the case. "May I write?" she asked. Nothing. Then the latch clicked, the case opened. Inside, the air was cool. Not cold, just hushed, reverent. She reached in and took the quill. It was warm, faintly vibrating like a creature barely awake. She set the parchment on the table, dipped the quill into nothing, there was no ink nearby, and gently touched it to the page. Words appeared. Faint at first, then bolder, like water drawn across thirsty ground. "Hello," it wrote. Martha's breath caught. She whispered back, though the quill didn't need voice. It seemed to hear through her thoughts. "Who are you?" she asked. The quill paused. Then, a passage. A bridge. A memory that wishes to remain. For the next hour, Martha spoke, sometimes aloud, sometimes not. The quill replied, slowly, thoughtfully. It did not speak like a person, nor like a book. Its words had rhythm, not logic. Meaning came in waves, not steps. She learned this much. The quill had once belonged to a ghost scribe. Not a ghost in the haunting sense, but a magical memory preserved by the founders for reasons long forgotten. The scribe had recorded dreams, not facts, not spells, but dreams of students, professors, creatures, storms, songs, dreams written down before they were forgotten, captured like butterflies in ink. And when the scribe had passed, or faded rather, the quill had been left behind, half aware, gently drifting between the waking world and the space where dreams wait. Martha asked, "Why me?" The quill's answer was faint. "Because you see the silence." She touched the feather's stem, wondering what that meant. But in her heart, she understood. She had always felt things others did not. The sadness in a cracked tile, the loneliness in an unopened book, the quiet joy of an early snowfall that no one else had yet noticed. The next evening, she returned, and the next, and the quill remembered. She brought blank parchment each time. The words changed. Sometimes the quill wrote her name in strange, curling script she could not translate. Sometimes it drew pictures, delicate ink dreams of forests and flying staircases, and ships made of song. Sometimes it simply waited. One night, the quill asked a question. "Would you like to see?" "See what?" Martha asked. The ink shimmered. "The place between." And then, before she could ask what that meant, the page beneath her hand began to ripple. Not tear, not burn, just ripple, like water stirred by invisible fingers. The world around her bent slightly. The shelves didn't vanish, or they stretched. The ceiling grew taller, the floor softened, glowing faintly. And suddenly she was somewhere else. Still in the library, but not quite. It was brighter, though no candles burned. The shelves were endless, arcing above like trees in a forest cathedral. Books fluttered slightly as if breathing. Whispers hung in the air, not from mouths, but from the pages themselves, and walking among them were people made of light, soft, shimmering outlines, not solid, not ghosts, just memories. She saw a small boy humming to a book that sang back, a tall woman whose fingers trailed behind her in music, a group of students sleeping on cushions as a hovering tome told them stories in 6 voices at once, and in the center of it all, the quill. Larger now, alive, floating above a pedestal made of woven parchment and dream threads. It turned to her, not physically, but in presence, and she felt the words in her bones. This is what remains when words are honored. She blinked. Her eyes were full of tears and stars. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "You don't have to," the quill said. "But if you stay too long, you'll forget where you came from." She nodded. She understood. With one breath, the library folded gently like a book being closed, and she was back. The parchment still before her, the ink still shimmering, the candle nearly out, the quill now rested in her hand, silent again. But different. It had given her something, or perhaps she had given it something. In the days that followed, Martha wrote more than ever. Not for marks or professors, but for the library itself. Stories that had no characters but had feelings. Observations. Fragments of dream. She never spoke of the quill to anyone, but she did, on rare evenings, guide others to the chair near the glass case. And sometimes, not always, the latch would click, and another soft soul would be given passage. For the quill had waited a long time to be remembered, and now it wrote again, through them, in them, and somewhere just between waking and sleeping, a forgotten scribe smiled and turned the page. There is a quiet that settles over the Hogwarts library after the midnight bell. Not silence, no, but something gentler, a hush as if the shelves themselves are listening, and it is in this hush that the books begin to sleep. Not all books sleep, of course. Some, like the grumpy self-updating almanacs or the chronically argumentative spell theory volumes, remain stubbornly alert, twitching their pages and muttering footnotes into the dim hours. But others, the older ones, the wiser ones, drift softly into slumber. These books do not dream in the way people do. Their dreams are slower, older, made of parchment rustlings and fading ink, of memories once read and read again. They do not forget. They remember us long after we have gone. And it was into such a night that Professor Norrell of Enchanted Archives stepped, barefoot and wrapped in a thick blue shawl stitched with glowing runes. Her lantern floated beside her, casting light that smelled faintly of honey and cedar. She moved slowly, reverently, down the eastern wing, the one where the ceiling curved like the inside of a bell, and where the air always felt like autumn. Norrell had worked at the school longer than most had lived. Some said she had been here since the last stone was set into the foundations, though she never confirmed it. Her specialty was listening, not to students, though she was kind, but to books. That night she paused in front of a particular shelf that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Its wood had darkened with time, and a faint shimmer of protective charm still hovered around it, like mothlight. She extended one finger and tapped the air. The charm melted. From within, she drew a volume bound in sleeproot leather, its surface soft as petals, its title long since faded. The book sighed in her hands. "You're nearly gone, aren't you?" she whispered. The book didn't reply with words. It never had. But a gentle warmth travelled up her palms, and she knew what it meant. It was forgetting. Even magic could not hold all things forever. This book, once full of star-lore and forgotten skies, had not been opened in over 100 years. Its maps had curled, its constellations had dimmed, and now it hovered at the edge of disappearance. Not destroyed, just drifting away. Professor Norrell sat cross-legged beneath the high window, her shawl pooling around her like a tide. She opened the book carefully, slowly, as though waking a child who had slept too long. Inside, the pages barely moved, but she began to hum. A soft melody, one of those old Hogwarts lullabies no one ever sang aloud anymore. One made of small notes and winding phrases, meant not for people, but for pages. The book stirred, faint lights danced across the margins, fragments of long-lost constellations blinking like sleepy eyes. A delicate map of the eastern stars unfolded piece by piece, revealing names that hadn't been spoken in centuries. Norrell smiled, and in a voice barely louder than the rustling leaves outside, she began to read. Not the words, not directly, but the spaces between. She spoke the quiet of the page, the echo of former readers, the weight of knowledge once held with trembling fingers. And slowly, the book began to remember itself. Lines sharpened, ink darkened. A faint aroma of midnight skies and cloud moss rose from the spine. The book was still fading, but gently now, lovingly, like a story that knows it's near its end but wishes to be told once more. Outside the window, a few stars blinked back into view. She closed the book with both hands, and for a moment it pulsed. A warm heartbeat in the quiet. Then stillness. The kind that fills the room when something is at peace. From across the room, another book stirred, a journal of wand makers, curious and quiet. Then another, a history of dreams once dreamt by potion masters. Professor Norrell looked up. It had begun, the sleep of books. One by one the volumes settled, their covers softened, their bindings relaxed. Faint lines of magic traced the edges of shelves, not protective now, but comforting, like blankets. Even the ghostly librarian, Madame Pelwin, glided through the aisles a bit more slowly, her lantern flickering a shade warmer than usual. She didn't disturb them, she only watched, and perhaps remembered what it was like to dream. Back in her chambers, high above the northern turret, Norrell placed the fading star book on a velvet cushion, not to keep it, not to preserve it unnaturally, but to give it rest. Books, like people, she believed, should be allowed to sleep when their time had come. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear pages turning, not from hands, but from the dreams of the books themselves, whispers of ink and memory, echoes of stories once told. And if you sit quietly with a warm cup beside you and the window just barely cracked open, you may hear it too, that gentle rustle that isn't wind. It's the library dreaming, and in that dream all stories live a little longer, especially the quiet ones. Not all secrets in the Hogwarts library live between pages. Some rest behind them, behind shelves, beyond panels, through tiny, almost forgotten archways only visible in the candlelight's last flicker. One such secret lies in a narrow crevice just behind the astronomy compendium stack, a space no wider than a suitcase, yet deeper than one might expect. This was the clockmaker's niche, though few knew it by name. It had no official entry, no enchanted map, and no magical wards. Only a small brass plate set crookedly on the wall behind a sagging stack of broken telescopes. The plaque bore no words, only a symbol, an hourglass with one grain suspended in mid-air. Most students mistook it for decoration. A few inquisitive ones tried to pry it loose, only to find that touching it made them drowsy, irresistibly so. They'd forget what they were doing and wander off to nap beneath a sunny window or in the warm folds of a spellbook glossary. Only once in several generations did someone step inside the niche. This tale follows one such visitor. Her name was Leonie Wenderley, a quiet fourth year who preferred maps to mirrors and clocks to cauldrons. She could usually be found repairing old sundials in the courtyard or rewinding broken timepieces gifted to the school by alumni long dead. Time fascinated her. Not the grand sweep of centuries, but the tick, tick, tick of the everyday. The simple dignity of passing minutes, the soft tragedy of missed bells. One foggy afternoon, while dusting the upper shelves of the library as part of her volunteer duty, Leonie dropped her rag. It fell behind a large atlas cabinet and slipped, strangely all out of sight. Muttering, she climbed onto a narrow stool and reached over, only to glimpse something unusual, the edge of that crooked brass plate. The hourglass shimmered faintly as if one grain of light floated just above it. Leonie felt drawn. Not in a dangerous way. There was no lurch of magic or echo of enchantment, just curiosity. The kind that feels like a thread tugging your sleeve in a silent room. She pressed her hand against the hourglass. Nothing happened at first. Then, with the smallest breath of movement, the walls swung inward. Inside was a room no larger than a cupboard. Dust motes hung in the air like frozen fireflies. At its center stood a single clock, tall, silver, and utterly still. Its pendulum did not move. Its face had no hands, yet it ticked. Tick, tick. Leonie stepped closer. Around the base of the clock were scattered tiny journals no larger than matchbooks. Some were bound in faded ribbon, others sealed with wax. One lay open, and she picked it up. Inside were entries, tiny, delicate entries, written in a dozen different hands. Returned the sound of a forgotten bell to the west staircase, Tuesday, 9:04 p.m. Mended 13 lost minutes from the herbology greenhouse, Thursday, 3:12 p.m. Held a silent hour for Headmistress Valore, Saturday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. These were not student notes, these were repairs, time repairs. The room began to hum, the silver clock let out a sound. Not a chime, but a sigh, and then the walls shifted. No longer bare stone, they now displayed flickering images, fragments of Hogwarts itself, captured at exact moments. A pair of students laughing beside the broken fountain, 1947. A lonely professor writing chalk equations no one would solve, 1831. An owl circling the astronomy tower in a storm, 2003. Leonie turned slowly. The room had become a museum of forgotten minutes. Moments unlived, unnoticed, but not unimportant. In the corner was a drawer labelled "For the Wandering." Clocks. She opened it. Inside were pocket watches, old, tarnished, cracked, each pulsing faintly like sleeping hearts. One leapt into her palm. It was her grandfather's, lost the day he vanished on the way to Diagon Alley. She blinked, heart rising in her throat. She remembered the day, the letter that never arrived, the unopened gift left by the fireplace. How had it found its way here? Tick, tick. The room was not just a sanctuary, it was a way station, a hidden keeper of lost time, suspended between the library and the flow of the castle's days. The clock began to move. Its pendulum swung once, then stopped. A faint whisper bloomed in the room, a voice like old gears and soft candlelight. Keeper needed. Leonie stood still. She knew what it meant. Not forever. No, the niche did not trap, but for a little while, till the next quiet soul came seeking time in places most had forgotten. She placed her grandfather's watch gently on the pedestal beside the silver clock. Its tick joined the others, and she sat, and she listened, and she began to write in a fresh matchbook journal, held 2 minutes of quiet for a memory almost lost. Friday, 4:42 p.m. Outside the door, the plaque shimmered once more. The hourglass still held 1 grain, waiting. The clockmaker's niche did not sleep, not in the way most spaces did. It rested perhaps like a cat curled on a sun-warmed stone, still, but not unaware. And Leonie, now nestled inside this hourless chamber, began to understand that time, like magic, could be softened, stretched like golden thread between the ticking moments of the world. It was here, after several hushed days, or had it only been hours, that Leonie found the candle. It stood at the very back of the room, in a shallow alcove behind the silver clock. It was not lit, yet it gave off a faint glow, not light, but presence. Its wax was pale blue like moonlight frozen, and tiny runes danced across its surface, rising and fading like fireflies blinking in sleep. A small placard carved of elderwood and half faded rested before it, the candle that remembers. Do not light unless you wish to remember something you have forgotten. Do not light unless you are ready. Leonie reached out but did not touch it. Instead, she sat beside it and watched. The candle did not burn, but the air around it felt warm, not with heat, but with memory. It was the kind of warmth one felt in old armchairs, in the pages of well-loved books, or in the hush of a place where someone once whispered your name gently. She had not expected the room to contain feelings. But the candle that remembers was more than enchanted wax. It was recollection itself, suspended in waiting. Leonie had always wondered about the gaps in her memory. Nothing tragic, nothing grand, but little things, small mysteries of her own life. Why she always felt unease in Greenhouse 3. Why she dreamed of blue feathers in the snow. Why the smell of ink sometimes made her want to cry. She wasn't afraid of remembering, not really. But she understood the warning. Memory changes you. And so, when she finally did touch the candle, it wasn't with curiosity, but with a quiet kind of reverence. Her fingers brushed its side. The wick flared. No flame appeared. Instead, the room shifted. It wasn't disorienting, not a jolt, nor a spin, just a deepening. The walls seemed to drift back like heavy curtains, and from the soft folds of the shadows, memories emerged, not just hers. She saw a girl from centuries past, curled in a windowsill of the old North Tower, reading aloud from a scroll of forgotten spells. She saw a boy with ink-stained sleeves gently teaching a small phoenix how to fly within the restricted section, careful not to wake the books. She saw an elderly librarian with shaking hands, lighting this very candle, tears in his eyes, whispering, "Just one more glance, please." The candle remembered everyone who had ever touched it. And it remembered something else too. Something that made Leonie's heart pause. Her first day at Hogwarts. But not the version she recalled. Not the one captured in photographs or echoed in letters home. This memory had been misplaced. She saw herself, age 11, seated on a long bench in the sorting hall. The candlelight flickering overhead. The hat already removed from her head. Whispers floating all around. And then, a voice. Not the hat, not a professor, but something behind her, software familiar. "You've found it again." She turned in the memory and saw no one. Only shadows and the gentle shimmer of enchanted flame. But the voice remained. And Leonie, watching this from the candle's glow, felt something inside her unlock, like a book's final page unsticking after years of waiting. She had been here before, not in this school year, not even in her first, but long ago, far before she was born, another child, another life. The candle that remembers was not bound by lifetimes. It held echoes, echoes that chose to return. Leonie saw an image of herself, or someone who once was her, walking barefoot through the candlelit corridors of a library not yet built, placing small feathers in the corners of stairwells, whispering spells of silence into the stones. She was a binder of memory then, a memory keeper. And the candle had been hers. It remembered her. And it had waited. Leonie wept, not with sorrow, but with relief. She did not need answers. The past did not demand explanation, only recognition. The flame in the candle flickered once, and then went out. The room returned to stillness. But Leonie felt changed, not newly made, not transformed, but restored. She had always wondered why she loved clocks, why forgotten staircases called to her, why candlelight felt like home. Now she knew. She was not just a student of magic. She was a listener of time. And the candle had reminded her. She placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "Thank you." The wax remained warm. Just once more before she left the alcove, she leaned in and breathed close to it. Not a flame, just a glow, a silent promise. And behind her, the silver clock ticked again. Tick, tick, faintly, gently, but with certainty. Time, like memory, always returns. The clockmaker's niche had shown her something vast, not just in space, but in understanding. After her time with the candle that remembers, Leonie began to move through the hidden library as though it recognized her now. The halls no longer echoed with emptiness, they hummed with memory, greeting her like a long-lost friend. There was one place she had not yet explored, a crooked stairwell she'd noticed, tucked behind a tapestry of a moth-winged owl. The staircase twisted upward in gentle spirals, its banister made of twisted brass and warm elderwood. But what had caught her attention, both earlier and now, were the feathers. They were not fallen, they were placed. Tiny feathers of silver blue, tucked at perfect intervals along each step, as if someone had once walked the stairway and left a breadcrumb trail of dreams. Leonie bent down and picked one up. It was softer than air, yet cool to the touch. And as she held it, a faint breeze stirred in the stairwell. Not wind exactly, but something thoughtful, like a breath remembering how to sigh. She climbed. Each step felt like an invitation. The kind of invitation written in invisible ink or whispered in the folds of a well-worn cloak. And then, near the top, she found it. A door. Wooden, narrow, older than the rest of the structure, carved with curling vines and strange avian runes. There was no handle, but a single feather rested in a groove at its center. She touched it. The door sighed open. Inside was a round room, its walls panelled in dark wood, lit by dozens of candles floating in a slow spiral above. Books lined the shelves in long curves, but these were not like the other books she had seen. Their spines shimmered like oil on water, and when she neared them, she heard soft whispers. Not words, but impressions, feelings. And in the center of the room stood a lectern made of feathers, not wood. No nails, no glue, just thousands of small feathers held in harmony, moving slightly in an unseen breeze. It should not have stood, but it did, gracefully, unshakably. On the lectern rested a single scroll, bound in silver thread, no title, no dust. She approached and unwrapped it. The writing shimmered softly, not ink, but memory. The scrolls spoke in symbols that danced, not across the page, but into the air before her, glowing, swirling shapes that tugged gently at her thoughts, showing instead of telling. She saw herself again, in a time far before her time, walking these stairs with careful steps, placing feathers not as markers, but as anchors. She was building a path, a bridge for the next version of herself to find her way back. She had known the forgetting would come, and so she had left a trail. Each feather was a moment, a promise, a tether to a truth she had once held close, that some parts of the soul never truly leave, they only sleep, waiting to be woken by magic gentle enough to understand them. The scroll folded itself as she wept quietly, not out of sadness, but for the strange, quiet joy of being seen, fully and without explanation. She replaced the scroll. As she turned to leave, something shimmered in the air behind her, a ghost, but not like the others she had seen. It was a shape of light and feather, vaguely bird-like, vaguely human, drifting near the shelves. It didn't speak. It only tilted its head as if proud. Leonie bowed her head, not in fear, but in respect. The ghost slowly extended a winged arm and pointed to a book on the highest shelf. Leonie climbed a narrow ladder and retrieved it. It was blank, but as soon as she opened it, words appeared. The memory of feathers, for the keeper returned. She smiled, tears catching the candlelight. She would stay here a while, read, rest. And when she left, if she left, she would know that she had not discovered something new, but simply remembered something that had always been hers. She tucked a silver blue feather into the book's binding. The staircase waited, spiraling gently downward, humming with memory. But Leonie did not rush. For the first time, time was hers, and so were the stories. The morning after Leonie's discovery in the feathered tower, the castle had turned hush-quiet. Not out of fear or storm, but as if it too were holding its breath, watching her move through its ancient arteries with new reverence. The whispers that had once scattered across the halls were now less elusive. They greeted her as she passed, like old friends recognizing a face from long, long ago. The library, the clocks, the stairwells, each had shared its story. But there remained one place she hadn't dared investigate. It lay not behind a secret door, nor above a winding tower. It was beneath, below the grand stone tiles of the library floor. She had noticed it early on, a strange board that hummed ever so faintly when she passed by it. Most would never have heard it, but Leonie had come to listen like the library itself was an instrument. And this note, this faint vibration beneath her steps, had always been there, patient. That morning she followed it. The floorboard in question was narrow and old, tucked behind a crooked study table near the west wall. She ran her fingers along its edge and felt a seam, faint, hidden in the grain. When she pressed gently, something shifted. The board gave a long, sleepy sigh, then lifted. Beneath was not a crawl space or a tunnel. Not exactly. It was a room, small, perfectly square, no more than a few steps wide, yet lined with velvet walls and candle sconces that lit as she descended. A small staircase led her downward into quiet, velvet-draped air. And in the center of the room stood a cabinet, carved from polished walnut, worn smooth by time and glowing faintly with a spell older than language. On the cabinet's front, 3 knobs, each marked by a symbol. The first, a moth curled in a crescent moon. The second, an open eye with a star inside it. The third, a hand holding a small stone. She didn't need instruction. She simply reached out and turned the first knob. The cabinet exhaled softly and clicked open. Inside sat a glass orb resting in a velvet cradle, and within the orb a swirling memory. She knew it immediately, not someone else's, Heron. She reached out, and without touch the memory began to play in the air. She was younger, far younger, curled beside her grandfather in an armchair. He was telling her a bedtime story about a library that remembered its readers, a place where dreams were shelved like volumes and those who wandered kindly were allowed to borrow forgotten truths. Leonie gasped softly. She had heard this story before, long ago. Her grandfather had been a professor once, long retired, long gone, but his stories had always seemed impossibly real, too vivid, too detailed. Now she understood. They weren't stories, they were memories, his and hers, passed down not in words but in quiet, sacred imaginings. She turned the second knob, another click, another orb, another memory, this time not of childhood, but of dreams. Her own dream from just weeks ago, before all this began, wandering through halls that shifted like fog, following a silver feather through endless shelves. At the time, she'd woken with no understanding. But now, it had been a calling, an invitation, left in the space between waking and sleep. The third knob, this one did not reveal an orb, but a stone, simple, smooth, pale green, not magical in appearance, yet warm to the touch. And as soon as she lifted it from its resting place, the velvet-lined walls of the room began to shimmer and fall away, not vanish, transform. She was no longer in a room. She stood in a grove, lush with moonlight and stillness, where books grew on trees and owls watched from low branches. It was a memory, yes, but not from her, not from any single person. This was the library's memory. The first story ever shelved, the first whisper ever spoken between book and reader, the beginning. A soft breeze carried scents of parchment, cedarwood, and candle wax. In the center of the grove, a circle of chairs stood empty, save one, and in it sat the feathered ghost. It nodded once. Leonie stepped forward, and without knowing how, she spoke. "I remember now." The grove brightened, not with light, but with presence. The floor beneath her steadied, velvet once again. She stood in the secret room. The cabinet closed gently behind her, but in her pocket the green stone pulsed, not as a relic, but as a key to return not only to this place, but to this feeling of being part of the story. 1110 9 8 7 6 5 4 3 2 1 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Document tabs, script description tags images, prompts 15,005 words. Turn on screen reader support to enable screen reader support. Press Ctrl plus Alt plus Z to learn about keyboard shortcuts. Press Ctrl plus / banner hidden show side panel, not a visitor, but a page. The library was growing quieter now, as if sensing that Leonie's journey was drawing toward its gentle end. The shelves no longer whispered, but breathed. The staircases did not creak, but sighed beneath her step. She moved like someone who had been here for years, not days, as if the place had settled into her bones and she into its memory. There was only one place left she had not dared enter, not out of fear, but because it had always seemed to wait. It lay tucked behind an ancient iron gate carved into the floor near the northmost tower chamber. At first glance, one might think it led to plumbing or maintenance, but Leonie knew better now. Books had their own ways of hiding secrets, and floors, it seemed, could keep stories sealed beneath them like hearts beneath ribs. She descended slowly. The stairs below the floor wound in a spiral like the inside of a conch shell. Walls grew damp with age, flickering with candlelight that had no visible source. Cobwebs stretched gently like lace, untouched by time or broom. She reached the bottom and stepped into a round, low-ceilinged room that smelled of parchment, clove, and moonlight. The walls were not lined with books. They were the books. Embedded directly into the stone, row upon row of volumes sat as if grown from the walls themselves, spines barely distinguishable from the cold stone behind them. It was not a room one entered for research, it was a room one entered to remember. In the center sat a single stone bench. Upon it, a book already lay open, waiting, not abandoned. Leonie approached, her breath softening, her heart quieting. The air here was dense, like fog made of memory. She looked down at the pages. They were blank, but not empty. A warm shimmer rose faintly from the paper, not unlike steam on a winter morning, and then she heard it. Not a voice, a sound, a song rising gently from all around her, but especially from within the walls. A hum of harmony and hush, of lullabies long forgotten, and the soft syllables of names no longer spoken aloud. These were the shelved souls. She sat slowly, her body folding into the stone like it had always meant to rest here. The book before her no longer shimmered. It began to write itself, not in ink, but in soft light. Each line unfurled as if sewn with thread of moonbeam and memory. The words formed in a hand not her own, but familiar, like a letter from someone who once held her hand in a dream. The story that unfolded was not fantastical, not filled with grand creatures or spells. It was the story of a girl who wandered through corridors of doubt, who stumbled through doors not meant for her, who whispered her fears to walls that never answered back. And then it told of how the walls began to whisper in return. The song grew stronger. It was not loud, but vast, made of hundreds, no thousands, of subtle notes woven like starlight and shadow. Leonie felt the presence of others in the room, though no figure moved. The souls were here, not trapped, not haunting, but resting. Each had once left behind something unfinished, some story too quiet to be written in louder places. Here, their tales continued, softly, patiently, in threads of sound and breath and light. One soul sang of a garden buried beneath snow. Another, of a spell etched into the feathers of a bird that never landed. Another still, of a boy who had whispered apologies into the wind, hoping they would find the ears of someone long gone. Leonie began to hum with them. Not words, just tone. Her voice joined the harmony without thought, like water finding a current. The book before her responded. The lines glowed brighter. Her hum deepened, and she realized she was not singing for the book. She was becoming part of it. Her own memory, her wandering, her quiet longings, all of it was being stitched into the song. She had not come here just to listen. She had come here to leave something behind. The souls did not speak in tongues or riddles. They did not teach. They did not scold. They listened. And in doing so, they allowed Leonie to speak without speaking. Her hands remained still, her lips barely moved, but her story poured into the room like a slow, golden river. The choices she had made, the books she had taken, the feather staircase, the forgotten candle, even the clock that kept no time. It all spilled from her in invisible waves, soaking into the shelves, joining the lives that had come before her. She did not know how long she sat there. Minutes melted into hours or dreams. The book eventually stopped glowing. The last sentence flickered gently before settling into the page like the final petal of a flower folding in. She reached out, touched the page, and closed the book. As she did, the song slowed, not ending, but easing into stillness, the way a lullaby fades just as a child falls asleep. Leonie stood, her feet light, her breath deep and even. She looked around at the walls, at the embedded books glowing faintly in their stone cocoons. She whispered, "Thank you." The air stirred gently in return, as if nodding. She ascended the stairway once more, not rushing, not afraid. When she emerged into the upper chamber, it was night. Not the kind of night filled with clocks and curfews, but the eternal twilight that libraries seem to keep just behind the veil of candles. She walked past shelves that no longer hid from her, past portraits that nodded gently without moving, past shadows that now curved around her as though to protect. She had become part of something old, something sacred. And though she had not come to the library with a question, she left with something better, a song within her that could never be taken. It would echo within her, quietly, like a heartbeat one only hears in silence. As she reached the arched doorway near the east wing, the lights of the main halls flickered softly, like a final farewell. And perhaps it was, or perhaps it was only a pause, until next time. Leonie lingered at the threshold of the eastern corridor, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the archway, as if waiting for a final blessing from the stone itself. The library, in all its layered silence, held its breath around her. Though nothing stirred and no voice called her back, she felt the farewell nonetheless, a soft, invisible tether gently unwinding from her soul. The warmth of candlelight brushed her back like a mother's hand, straightening a collar, and the lingering scent of worn parchment and cinnamon ink clung to her cloak like perfume from a forgotten memory. The halls she retraced now were not the same ones she had first wandered. They had changed, or perhaps she had. The ancient corridors no longer felt vast and unknowable, but intimate, like the echo of a lullaby hummed long ago. Each turn, each hidden alcove, each shadow had become familiar, beloved. She no longer walked as a stranger to the shelves, but as someone quietly known. Even the floor beneath her step seemed to soften its creak, as if acknowledging her passage with reverence. As she passed a reading gallery draped in ivy-shadowed glass, a ghostly candle floated past her shoulder, its flame pulsing with soft blue light. It bobbed once, almost like a nod, then glided away toward the darker edge of the hall. Leonie watched it go without fear. In this place, even the uncanny had grown gentle. She had come to understand that the library did not merely house books, it housed souls, stories, memories woven into its very dust and mortar. And now she too had become a stitch in its silent tapestry. She turned toward the grand stair of thistlebone, a spiral staircase tucked behind a veined emerald curtain that led upward through whispering floors of restricted archives and ancient study chambers. As she ascended, the scent of time grew lighter. Cobwebs thinned, the stone grew warmer, and the lanterns became less spectral and more golden. By the time she reached the upper rotunda, morning had begun to stretch across the sky outside, brushing pale light against the leaded windows. The library existed in all hours at once, but now it seemed to be offering her a door back into the world she had left behind. She paused beside a window overlooking the inner courtyard. There, the great silver-leafed elm of Eldridge stood, its branches unmoving despite the breeze. It was said the tree only swayed for students who spoke kindly to books, and Leonie, now quietly amused, gave it a nod and whispered a few words under her breath. Though the tree didn't visibly move, she felt its roots acknowledge her in some hidden way. It was enough. Reaching the main corridor once more, she passed the gilded bust of Professor Althea Morright, whose enchanted spectacles still hung suspended in mid-air before her sculpted eyes. Leonie smiled faintly. The professor had been one of the first to bring memory-binding magic to parchment, ensuring that stories didn't just live on paper, but remembered their readers. Leonie had once thought the idea absurd. Now she understood. Some books didn't just tell stories, they waited to tell them to the right person. Her satchel felt lighter than when she arrived. She had returned all that she borrowed, except, perhaps, the invisible things, the song, the hush, the way her breath now felt like part of a deeper rhythm. She knew she would carry it always, tucked behind her ribs like a folded note. Not everything she had found could be written down, and that, she realized, was the point. The truest magic wasn't the kind traced in wandlight or sealed in runes. It was the kind you never quite explained, the kind that came to you when you were ready and stayed long after. She passed beneath the final arch, the one that bore the inscription in soft curling script, "To leave is not to forget." Beyond it lay the exit corridor, the path that led back into the castle's quieter wings and student commons. Leonie slowed, then stopped. Behind her the library remained still, yet alive. Its silence was not empty. It was full of the lives it had touched, the stories it had offered, the gentle patience with which it waited for readers to become ready. She turned just once more and whispered, "Goodbye." But a voice, a gentle, breath-like murmur, floated through the air, brushing her thoughts like a feather on skin. Not goodbye, just rest. And with that she stepped forward. The halls outside the library were dim and still. The students were not yet stirring. It was that rare hour between dreaming and waking when the castle itself seemed unsure whether to continue sleeping or begin its day. Leonie moved through the corridors with care, not out of caution, but reverence. The quiet around her was not empty, it was listening. The portraits watched with the barest flicker of movement in their frames, and the stone beneath her feet pulsed with a warmth that had nothing to do with hearth or flame. She entered the small, common lounge near her dormitory, where a single teapot floated quietly above the hearth. It poured itself into a cup as she approached, the steam curling like soft question marks in the air. She cupped the mug in both hands and sat by the window, her cloak still faintly dusted with golden flecks of library light. She didn't think exactly. She didn't need to. The song she had heard in the shelved chamber still echoed in her, a sound not meant for words but for silences, for pauses between heartbeats, for the hush before sleep. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift, through staircases made of feathers, through candles that whispered warnings, through books that sang without ink, through ghosts that only lingered to listen, through a world that asked nothing of her except that she be present. She stayed there a long while, tea cooling slowly in her hands. Outside, dawn deepened into gold. Bells would soon ring across the towers, calling students to potions, to runes, to herbology, to charms. Leonie would answer, of course, but she would carry this night within her always. And if ever she felt lost in the hum of days and duties, she knew where to return, not just to the library's door, but to the silence within herself, to the place where stories waited not to be read, but to be shared. Later that morning, in the scriptorium, she would write her first line on a fresh sheet of enchanted parchment. She wouldn't try to retell it all. That wasn't the point. She would simply write, "The shelves remember everything you've forgotten. And when the time is right, they whisper it back." And somewhere deep beneath the castle, in stone and silence and candlelight, the book she had filled with memory closed itself gently and slid into the wall, nestled among the shelved souls. Another story complete, another listener found. Thank you for joining us tonight on Sleepy Quest. May the candlelight and quiet magic of the Hogwarts Library stay with you as you drift off, wrapping your dreams in warmth, wonder, and whispers from another world. If you enjoyed this tale, we'd love for you to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We share new bedtime journeys every week, filled with soft enchantments and sleepy lore. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and remember, the quietest stories, often the ones that stay with us the longest. Good night, dear listener.